and get you to just share it with us. Let us be your students and you run us through it. That's beneficial for everybody because you get a chance to do a run through before you do it with real students, and we get to use your method in our own teaching as well. Subject matter, yeah, it can be used as a checklist, and provide resources for each learning experience. So that's our really wonderful, powerful document that's going to guide our lessons. Now let's have a think about what quality assessment is. What is it? Because we can't do effective teaching and learning. Well, actually we probably can. In fact, I would argue that for a long time schools have been doing really quality teaching and learning, but not necessarily delivering quality assessment to students. So you probably can do it, but we don't. We want quality assessment and quality teaching and learning. So, how familiar are we with the attributes of quality assessment? I have talked about them, referred to them. Are you feeling quite vague, a bit foggy about what they are? If I say attributes of quality assessment, do any words come to mind?
Validity, reliability, and the other one?
Yes!
Equity.
Accessibility.
Accessibility.
You could even make an acronym, couldn't you, with that? Validity, reliability, accessibility, VAR, RAV, I don't know, whatever you want to help you remember it. But they are the ones that we are actually talking about. So, what I want you to do is have a think about what you expect of the assessments that you do here at QUT. What do you expect? Because that's part of your understanding of what quality assessment is, and what you would expect in an assessment instrument that you would give to a student in your class when you go out on prac or next year. What do students have the right to demand in their assessment? Go. Talk, share.
What's the characteristic again? Validity, accessibility.
Reliability.
No, don't cheat yet. Don't look it up, even though I commend you for doing so, because you're about to Google, aren't you?
No, I'm just having
Okay, well, go right
Yeah,
ahead.
they're all up in
Excellent.
Yeah,
They're all up in the
what we did last semester, I just could not remember.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're all up on the QTA website.
Yeah.
They're going to roll off your tongue like you wouldn't believe
Yeah.
within a very short time.
Well, yeah, I wrote for that essay that we had to do last year. I wrote about how reliability is not as important as the other two.
Oh, wow, I'd like to have a debate with you. Yeah, okay.
Well, I mean, you work for like an authority that sort of like, you know, you have a vested interest in that.
Is that the source of my consternation at that statement?
Yeah. Well, I mean, like, it's still like important, but I was like, you know, reliability can't trump these other factors. You know, and so like trying to define, like, I say it's futile to sort of like aim for a truly like objective assessment that like can measure everything and be perfectly replicable in other situations. But while people are trying to do that and they're spending time trying to do that, assessment isn't being made, you know, more quality. They aren't actually valid. Yeah, it's like validity is being trumped by reliability. Well, I say it's the other way around. It should be the other way around.
That's really interesting. I'd like to take this discussion further. In fact, remind me at the end. I'm not out to disprove you or argue with you. I'm just really genuinely interested, and I understand what you're saying. You're saying there's only so much time. If you think of a pie, there's only so much time. How are you going to divvy it up? Where are you going to spend most of your time? And yeah, I think that's a very interesting point. We'll come back to that.
I'm keen to argue constantly.
Yes. Yeah, righto. Bring it on. What do you want in your assessments?
Critical thinking skills, but like the assessment, I think should, with that, I mean, it should produce skills, knowledge, understandings that can be transferred to other things. You know, they shouldn't be like completely like isolated skills.
Okay, so relevant, meaningful, and authentic. Yes. On the task sheet, when someone gives you a task sheet, what do you expect to be there? Context, yeah. That's on our quality assurance tool on the QCAA portal, so tick. Yes, there needs to be a context. The context is the situation in which learning takes place. Yes, students need a context. And in English, we want another context in addition to that. We need the student to understand who they're writing for. Like, are they writing to the CEO of the company, or is it the Queen, or is it some blog forum on a public website, or is it a literary column? And what role they have in that. So there are two contexts for English. Probably a lot of subjects really when you think about it. So context. What else would you like on your task sheet? A solid layout, a neat and tidy structure.
Yeah, I like the sort of like the context on the front and then like all the jargon on the back. I think that really works. So it's like, you know, you position, it's like, imagine you are a poet, or imagine you are this and this is what you're going to do. And then on the back you can still be like, okay, this is how it actually connects to that, with like all the jargon, these are the assessment objectives and blah 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 blah.
So you get an introduction, a brain warm-up sort of thing, and then you go into the nitty-gritty of the detail. So layout's important. Yes, that's also on our quality assurance tool. Well, what about language? Readable, understandable?
I think it's important to have, like, often, not definitions as such, but like especially coming from, like, when we had to do this for like drama as my TA too, and you would talk about like, we're doing this kind of theatre, and then you'd have to list, these are the conventions of it, so the kids knew, like, it's not just something I have to like they had the skills down written on the thing, like, these are conventions you actually need to follow, and it's like defining things within the task.
Because there should be no guessing. Students should not have to guess, and parents should not have to guess. What about the conditions? 4 to 6 minutes. Yep, they should be there. What about the alignment with the syllabus? QCAA want to see that, and parents want to see that.
Yeah.
That gives them predictability.
It's like transparent as well. It's like, it also just helps with accountability. I understand why it gets put on the back, you know, but then, you know, you get a task sheet at the back, and hopefully the task sheet is like, or the rubric, sorry, is like filled out properly, and it's like, this is what you did right, this is what you didn't do right, and it means that the teacher, in a real ideal scenario, the teacher wouldn't have to provide any feedback more than just sort of marking the rubric, and I know that's not the case, but like, that is, it means that it cuts down on all that like time and effort of like debating over semantics and stuff.
It does, and that also links really nicely back to this idea of your students knowing and understanding the objectives. If you teach those, let's say it's first day of year 11 and you've got this, 25 students who just rolled up to your classroom. I would spend the first week, or however many lessons it would take, to actually have a learning experience or multiple learning experiences for each objective, so that my students know and understand what that means in the ISMG when I give it back. So when I put a tick on one of those descriptors, they know, okay, I've actually experienced that, I know what that means. So yes. So clear language, readable layout, alignment with the syllabus, clear instructions. In the IA1, for example, in your task statement, think back to the TLAP, you're going to have a word in there. You have to have a particular word in there in order to align your task with the syllabus. What is it going to be? Think back to objectives 3, 4 and 5. You can cheat.
I'm trying to cheat.
Yeah. Because it's part of their task command. Unless you frame it as a question, what do you reckon the word is? What's the crux of the IA1?
Analyze?
Analyze. Yeah. You can pose a question to students, or you give them a task statement. Analyze the representation of blip, 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 blip in 2 texts. So if analyze is not there, those tasks will not be endorsed for English. That's how important that word is. So they're the things that you would expect. Validity is all about that. And also item construct. In English, we use only the extended response because students are writing so much. So your task needs to enable students to write an extended response. You don't give them a really basic thing that can be done in 40 words, for example. It has to be that complex enough that students can spend 1,500 words responding to. So there are that's validity and accessibility, which is about our task sheets. Reliability is about, imagine this, and I posed this to the students yesterday. Imagine you've just marked an entire class of students' work, and then it's a week later. Do you reckon that you would pick up the same student responses and put exactly the same mark on them if you had removed all the marks from a week before? That's an interesting question, isn't it? I was thinking about that. I think the ISMGs allow us to do that and give us greater reliability so that even your intra-marking reliability is strong. And it was quite interesting, if you look at the recordings from yesterday's unit, the students marked a response and the marks that every student gave was bang on, same number for one of the criteria, which is really interesting. And everything else was only 1 mark out or bang on. So I think it is possible, but you can only do it if you really understand what the marking guide is asking you to mark, which comes back to knowing the objectives. Okay, let's have a look at what QCAA say they are now. So validity is the extent to which an assessment accurately measures what is intended to measure. Now for your T-Labs, I'm not, like I said, expecting you to be a guru of writing assessment because it's really hard to do well. But close enough is good enough. If you have any worries about your task, you can come and see me. But this is what it is, aligned to what is taught. But you can see that I can do a quick check because you're giving me your task. And I'm looking at all your learning experiences so I can check that alignment. If your IA1 is a blog, a literary blog, and there's nothing in your teaching and learning experiences about the genre or the patterns and conventions, which is objective 1 of the literary blog, I'm going to have major concerns. Does it test what the task is meant to test? That comes back to the syllabus. So if you had explained the representation of blip, 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 that would not do it because syllabus requires analyse and explain is a lower cognition. If it was essential English, then that would be okay. It needs to reflect curriculum requirements, and so I guess an example of that would be unpacking a representation, analysing a representation. You'll use representation all the time. So most likely, the syllabus requires us to assess a student's ability to analyse a representation in 2 texts. Your TLAP is going to have lots of references to representation, and I would argue that you might try and find a way to make such an abstract concept of representation a physical thing. Do you ever think about that? And at the end, perhaps come up with a way that you can make that a very concrete thing for students. What does representation mean? It's everywhere in our syllabus. And there was one activity I used to do with my students across all year levels to try and explain what that actually meant to them. Anyone got any ideas now? Do you think that every time you open your mouth you're representing yourself in some way? Yeah. Do you think that you're representing yourself in a certain way by everything you wear, by your dress, the way you wear your hair, the way you interact with other people? We're all representing ourselves all the time in a particular way. So So even that is worth thinking about. Do you want me to tell you what I used to do with students now, or do you want me to leave it to the end? Okay, so what I used to do was I would get a student to come up to the front of the class, and they're in their school uniform, and I'd ask one to push their socks down, to undo a shoelace. I'd get one student to untuck their shirt, loosen the tie, scruff up their hair, and adopt a really slovenly looking posture. And the other one, who often I wouldn't have to do much to, just make sure the socks are up, shoelaces are tied up, shirt's nice and neat and tucked in, tie, hairs, and even put their Panama hat on. And right there and then, you can talk about how one student is representing himself or herself and their school, because they're representing their school, and how that other student is representing himself or herself and that school. So when I went to the shopping centres after school and I saw students wandering around with really scrappy uniforms, they're making a really loud statement about how they feel about their school. And that's a really strong visual representation. So the kid who's got the shirt out and the tie not even on perhaps, or looking a bit shambly, is saying what about them and their school? They don't care about it. They're not a conformist. They're a rule breaker. They don't value the reputation of their school necessarily. They don't value neatness or tidiness. The student who is wearing their uniform correctly is saying the exact opposite. I'm proud of my school. I want to respect my school. I want to establish a positive reputation for my school and that sort of thing. And some people don't actually care about uniforms, and there are some schools who think that it's not such a big deal. There are other schools who are really particular about it, and they're particular about it because they think if you let one thing go, then you can see other things go as well. But that's an ideological position, and that's not one here. So we talked about this. You guys said this, are authentic and appropriately challenging. That comes into context. What is the context that you're going to devise for your task? Do you want your students to write a literary blog for, I don't know, some website out there? That's fine, absolutely fine. You can do that. Do you want them, because it has to be analytical in nature, it can be a little bit reflective. It's how you want to set it up. If you want it to be reflective, you need to have some reflective learning experiences, because students aren't going to necessarily know how to write in a reflective tone, and that is so much fun. And I'm going to actually show you a reflective essay, because it's quite unique. And the IA1 has that capacity to be quite engaging. So if you're a journalist, or you know a journalist, or you like writing and reading feature articles, then you could ask students to do a feature article for the IA1 instead of a literary blog. But feature articles are really hard to write. They're probably the genre that students struggle with the most. It's really deceptive, because it's that really relaxed conversational tone, but it's intellectual chattiness as well. There's an intelligence, like a real level of sophistication for the IA1, simply because it's analytical and you're working with prescribed texts. So that also comes into authentic. Where would a student most likely produce your genre that you have chosen for them? So it's just worth thinking about. Providing realistic context that's married to that allows students to demonstrate specified performance levels within curriculum documents. So that's making sure your task is not too hard, that it's outside what the syllabus requires, or that it's not too easy and doesn't allow students to do what they need to do. So accessibility, I'm not going to go through all these because accessibility is self-explanatory really in terms of clear, appropriate use of layout, cues, visual design. It is extraordinary how many schools accidentally and unintentionally provide contradictory instructions to students on their tasks. An example might be specifying a short story up here and then accidentally calling it a review or an essay, simply because in a lot of instances they've copied and pasted tasks from one template into another and they don't always catch it. Or at the start of the document asking students to analyse a representation, and that is what you'll do. You will never ask students to analyse multiple representations in prescribed texts. Why? Think of the prescribed text. Let's say we've got, maybe you're doing a task on, let's go 1984, and I don't know, maybe it's a student's song of their own choice, or maybe it's poetry. They're really dense texts. Why do you only ever ask a student to analyse a singular representation?
Because they can just go forever.
That's enough. They're limited to time and conditions, but it's also because, as you indicate, they could go forever. How many representations are there in any text? Hundreds. There's representations of everything to do with humanity in a text. Love, jealousy, hate, romance, gender, identity, belonging, family, power, femininity, masculinity, and the list goes on and on and on. So sometimes schools will have a singular representation, as they should do up here, and then down below they'll slip into the plural form of representation, which is a little bit confusing for students. So if I said to you, analyse a representation of belonging, analyse a representation of totalitarianism in 1984 and this text, that's hard, right?
Mm.
They don't need multiple representations. They don't need to analyse the representations of totalitarianism and power. Power is actually subsumed within totalitarianism anyway, or the representations of totalitarianism and love. Because they only have 1,500 words, and you could write an entire thesis. So, instructions that are clear, concise, and unambiguous, and so on. You will find that very quickly on the QCAA website. If you jump onto it, you don't need to do it now. In the right-hand corner, there's a white box. It's a search engine. You type in attributes of quality assessment, and this will come up. Okay, so in terms of your task statement itself, you have to understand the attributes of quality assessment to do it. And that's why I specifically stipulated the cognitive verb of analyse if you're going to use a task statement. It would be shattering to see a task statement that does not use the cognitive verb of analyse or does not allow students to analyse. That's if you're using a question. And the use of the word representation, those sorts of things. You must understand the objectives, especially the cognitions. You need to understand genre, audience, context, and purpose. So those 4 things need to be in your task. What is a genre? It's actually amazing how many tasks I see where the genre is not written. For example, a school might say, write or create a multimodal text. How many different multimodal texts are there? There are vlogs, there are video essays, there are PowerPoint presentations. So, what genre do you want your students to produce? Now this is an IA1, so it's going to be none of those. Who is the audience? Because that's going to affect the way the students are writing. If it's a church congregation, for example, students are probably going to include some biblical references, but they might not do that if it's not a church congregation. And the context, who they're enrolled as, it's probably themselves, and what the purpose is, and it's probably going to be to inform.
So do you have to be more specific with like audience, so you can't just say like a public audience? So like a blog is like a public audience but do you have to like narrow it down even more?
If you have specified a particular website, like LitHub or some of those other ones, then your audience is implied. Your audience are the users of that website. I would always specify, even if you are using a real live literary website, for the audience I would still say readers of blah blah blah. website, blogs,
Mhm.
just to make it absolutely clear. With some tasks, the audience is not necessarily implied. By the genre, I'm trying to think of an example. The only one I can think of, and it's not really a true one, is a student writing an email. Who is the audience going to be? That could be anyone. And you wouldn't do that for the IO1. I'm just thinking about another syllabus.
But can you do like, I don't know, like an open letter or something like that, like to the public?
An
Like-
epistolary letter, maybe.
What's that?
It's where you've got you wouldn't, and that's a really good question, because it comes back to that on the slide before. It's talking about a realistic and authentic context. You wouldn't really have an IA1 type style written in the genre of a letter, and you wouldn't have an epistolary letter. So an epistolary letter is like a narrative or a story within the letter. So the letter might be about the need to affect climate change, and an epistolary letter will have a narrative component within that is quite significant. And an epistolary narrative is a student writing a narrative, a short story, but in letter form. So it's kind of, I can't imagine an authentic context as a letter, because I can't imagine anyone writing a letter to someone else where they're analysing two texts. Know what I mean?
Yeah, good. So right now I'm sort of thinking, like a feature article for a certain publication, you know,
Yeah.
that's like got a particular audience that you can get students thinking about, you know, like what are the demographics of the reader or something like that.
Can you just make that up?
You can make that up. Literary blog is becoming a very big one, because the blog is a fluid genre and it can be used in lots of different formats.
And you can say like these are the readers, or it's like they cover these sort of topics or something like that.
And if you want a reflective arm to it, which I think is really valuable, then
The blog is
The blog is
the way to go. Yeah.
a really good way to go.
I don't know, like feature journalism is also getting a bit more like reflective. I think people are
It is.
putting themselves into it, you know, like gonzoing sort of stuff.
Absolutely. And I guess it comes down to how confident you are at the particular genre you want to teach.
Yeah, I think
too.
feature articles are particularly difficult to write.
Yes, they are difficult to write. So just make sure you've got those components. Again, we can turn these into a checklist. We're not going to do that today, but if you wanted to, you don't actually have to, because the QCAA already has a checklist for you. It's called the Quality Assurance Tool, and when you go out into school land, if I was you, I'd be saving some of these documents on a USB and or printing them out so that you've got them, just so that you've got them. Now, overall reflections and activities throughout the topic. This is about making your learning and your teaching relevant to students, which is kind of one of Walke's differentiation strategies as well, with that idea of bridging. But if your teaching and learning experiences don't connect to the student's reality or their real world or life in general, contemporary society, I would argue why you're doing it. Know what I mean? So it would be good to have some reflective activities throughout the topic in your TLAB. Why? Well, inquiry questions prompt deep reflection and develop relevancy, as well as sparks curiosity. And when there's a really nice alignment, you know, on the TLAB where we read that first bit and I said it's the so what of the unit, why are you doing that? I tell you what, some students wrote some really beautiful reasons and really explained so well in a previous unit why they were doing what they were doing in their TLAB. And it was just so heartwarming to see that they hadn't just gotten the syllabus and said, I've got to do this, this and this. They thought about why they were doing it, why it was meaningful, why it was important for students to do it that way. You know, it was really exciting to see. Often asking students deep, reflective questions meaning of humanity, the meaning of life, you know. It reminds us to have skill building activities that span the unit systematically and methodically. When we have a look at the sample in a moment, you'll see that there are deliberate things that aren't quite right with that. But if you don't have grammar activities in your TLAB, I'm probably going to be a little bit worried, because you cannot assume that Year 11, Year 12 students know their grammar. I think it helps us to brush up on our grammar and our punctuation rules. And we're adults, our students are going to need help. So make sure you intersperse your TLAB with grammar. And that there's, you know, some opportunities for them to think about what they think and why they think. And often you can do that in connection to the text and focus on self-improvement. So there's a reflective question. What drives learning? And we've talked about objectives to death. How are you going to structure your TLAB? 11 objectives. Doesn't mean that you have one learning activity for each objective. You can decide how you want to do it. You might decide, in fact, I would almost guarantee that objectives 3, 4 and 5 are going to need a lot of your energy as a teacher, because it's hard work analysing someone else's text. Students need a lot of practice at doing that. So you might have more learning experiences on that, on those objectives. Which ones are you going to start with? Do you want to start with the genre that students have to produce? It's up to you. Have a think about it. But you will have a list and you will tick off each of your objectives as you've covered them in your TLAB. Did you have a question?
No.
Nope. Okay. I think we can spend 2 minutes on that. Pick one objective and explain it to the group. Open up your syllabus to page 6 or 7, or is it 4 or 5?
This assignment in particular hits every objective.
Yeah. I need to know that you understand all 11 objectives, which is why I want all 11 objectives in there in some way. And like I said, for some of these objectives, you can do a quick 10-minute activity. That simple and complex activity we did the other day, I don't know how long that took, it wasn't that long.
The Fantail one?
Yeah, the Fantail one. And that way you've ticked off pretty much objectives 10 and 11 in the one activity. Pick one and then explain it to the group, please.
I'm just going to pick number 1.
Yeah, go for it.
So that's like if you're doing a feature article, using the pull quotes and using the informal language, but as you said before, keeping it quite sophisticated. And if it's like poetry, you'd be doing it in verse or rhyming couplets and kind of the language conventions that are attributed to a different form of text and that kind of thing.
Because you want your students to actually write one of those and not an essay or a blog. I'm glad you used the word pull quote, because the very fact that you've used it there has just sank it deeper in my memory.
So is that what you're thinking about right now, sort of like a journalistic sort of thing?
Yeah, so if I were to design an IA1 task, I think I'd do a feature article, just because my background's in journalism and I kind of know that kind of area. So.
And I reckon, because I'm a freelance journalist, when you've written so many yourself, you're generally pretty good at teaching the genre.
Yeah, well, on prac I had 2 Year 9 English classes and 1 Year 12, and they were all doing feature articles.
Wow.
So I got pretty good practice teaching those.
It's quite interesting. So there's a little bit of a movement away from feature articles in the senior space, but that doesn't make them any less valid.
All the students hated it too. So.
They do. I don't think feature articles are dying anytime soon, so you could argue that it's authentic, because feature articles generally are very easy to read, enjoyable, hobby type style reading.
Yeah.
So yep, that's all good, thank you. Objective 1's done. Someone else?
Well, if you just want to go down the list,
Yep.
the 2.
Oh, you're hitting that one.
Well, I just want to like I don't like switching sort of like ideas and topics and things like that. If say you were going to do like a feature article, would that like be doing a lesson of like explaining the role of a journalist, you know, and what they do within society? Is that not just like completely taking a stab in the dark with
Yeah.
that?
So that's actually a very important objective. And I'm going to answer your question, but I'm going to give you an example to help answer your question. Especially in the spoken role. So when your student is doing a persuasive speech for the IA2, they're going to have to establish and maintain a role with the audience. Now, if your student is standing there like this and barely even moves and doesn't even, you know, their eyeballs don't move in any direction, shape or form, and they're really bland and dull and they're not using facials, you can tell straight away that I'm not establishing or maintaining any connection with the audience. I'm establishing a role of sorts, but what sort of role is that? It's always the role of the text giver to the text receiver. So in that example, my role hasn't even really been established, because my role is as someone who's passionate about a particular issue. That's my role. I'm there advocating for a call to action or something in that persuasive genre. And my role is to convince them that I am right. So if I'm standing there like this, yeah, and even if I'm bored by myself, I haven't even established the role that I'm meant to take on. In the feature article, yes, you would want students to read lots of feature articles, and you'd want your students to understand the role of the journalist, but you also want them to know what role they have to establish.
Well, yeah, in writing, it's very like depersonalized, very authoritative. You don't put yourself in there usually. You know, you kind of.
But you could for the IA1 if you wanted to.
You could, but I mean, like, wouldn't that be like establishing, maintaining the role? Like, the journalist
Yes.
is usually like this, like, overseer, the expert, the overseer. They don't really put themselves into their own thoughts and opinions into the piece. Even though you can now, it's getting a lot more
I think
flexible.
with the feature article as well, sometimes that's the more casual journalistic approach, where it's often people will start with like I was at the movie theatre, and like their hook is like a personal
That's right.
anecdote, and
Yeah.
I think that's often how kids take it as well. They're like, they still have to be like an expert opinion, but there's more of that personal, like it's not all third person, like
It's more
you
like
can't have the
conversational,
Yeah.
colloquial.
It's intellectual chattiness, and that's why it's sometimes hard to master, because some people go down the line of all academic, analytical, and or they do all chit chat, you know, language choices that are, you know,
Yeah, journalism.
every day.
It's like democratic though. Like, the lay people have to be able to read it. It's not like for
That's right.
academics. It has to
Yes.
be read by everyone.
Otherwise people won't read it.
Yeah, which is tough though, because it's like you have to take like these complex like situations and ideas and explain them so that everyone should be able to understand it.
And that's why some people might say that the feature article may not be the best genre for the IA1, but I can see how it would work.
I mean, that's quite a skill that you're being able to measure in your kids, if they can like synthesize the text to be succinct and simple and understandable, but still be covering complex concepts.
Somehow you have to interject sections with some of that, you know, with fragmented sentences and that conversational tone, without it being too analytical in this paragraph and then a sudden breakout into chattiness, and then there's another diving into deep analysis, and then coming out in the next paragraph with, oh, what do you think, or, you know, or a rhetorical question.
It is kind of crazy, I think, because people spend someone can spend 10 years doing a study, like a scientific study, and then this journalist comes along and has to explain it in 500 words or less, so someone can read it, you know.
Isn't that the whole point of the conversation? Isn't that what they do? You know, that website? Where it's
Yeah,
like a conversation between
well, it's
journalists.
it's what everyone does, or you know, right now with coronavirus, people, it's some of the best minds in the world are putting their heads together to try and figure this out, and journalists kind of have to just take it and be this is what's going on
Make
right
sense
now,
of it.
and make sense. It's this kind of sense-making process. But yeah, no, that's cool. I get that.
Editorials are an opinionative piece, obviously, where the I is everywhere. I think we'll see a lot of literary blogs in the IA1, because I think schools may be a little nervous about being too relaxed and trying to combine the intellectual chattiness with the academic analysis part of it. and the blog is so fluid. But whatever you want to do, So yes, so that is objective 2. So you'd be able to come up with really fun learning activities with maintaining roles of the writer, speaker, sign and signer,